Everyone. So welcome in. If you This is your first time here, I'm Robert Driver. I'm a postdoc at Duke University, and I just want to welcome you to the AOS Student Research Grant Seminar Series. And as you may already know, each year the AOS offers funding to students and early career researchers with the AOS Student Research Grant. And the AOS Student Research Grant Series celebrates the challenging and innovative work of the AOS Student Research Grant recipients by sharing this AOS funded or related work to AOS members. And each week we showcase the research or research plans of a 2024, 2023, or 2022 AOS Student Research Grant winner in a seminar style format. And we have one seminar each week for 15 weeks. I think this is week 10 or 11, actually. And we go until December 15th. So I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank the AOS and the AOS Student Affairs Committee for support and input, and especially thank Steph, our speaker today. And before we turn our attention to Steph's research, I want to mention if you have any questions, there will be time for a Q&A session at the end of Steph's talk. You can participate by using the raising hand icon in Zoom, and that will allow me to unmute you, and you can ask your question aloud. Or you can type anytime during the hour in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and I will check those questions and check all these different ways and read them all at the end of Steph's talk. I'd like to remind everyone that this is an AOS sponsored event and that all participants are required to follow the AOS Virtual Meeting Event Code of Professional Conduct. I will post a link to that code of conduct in the chat. I will also post a link to a post-seminar evaluation form where you can provide feedback to help us improve the seminar series as we go week to week here, and a contact email as well for the AOS Student Affairs Committee. That'll be the third link that I post. And please be aware that we are recording this talk. Okay, so Steph Szarmach is currently a James Smithson postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Institution. And Steph's academic career began with a bachelor's degree in biology and environmental studies from Oberlin College in Ohio. And Steph then went on to earn her master's degree in biology from Northern Michigan University in the labs of Dr. Catherine Teeter and Alec Lindsay, studying blue wildebeest genetic diversity in Zambia. Thought that was very cool. Steph's master's thesis is published in PLOS One. And Steph continued her graduate work at Penn State University in the lab of Dr. David Tays, researching the evolution and genomics of seasonal migration in parulid warblers, which she will talk about today. And Steph's research from her time at Penn State is published in molecular ecology and ornithology. In addition to the AOS Student Research Award, Steph won the Student Research Grant from the Animal Behavioral Society and the Paul A. Stewart Grant, which I believe is a grant specific for bird monitoring, if I got that right, from the Wilson Ornithological Society. And finally, in 2025, Steph joined the lab of doctors Nathan Cooper and Scott Yanko at the Smithsonian Institute for her James Smithson Postdoctoral Fellowship. So with that, I will turn it over to Steph for a talk entitled Revealing Migration Strategies of High-Latitude Breeding Myrtle Warblers Using Multi-Sensor Geolocators and Stable Isotopes.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Robert.
Yep.
Go ahead and share my screen. How does that look?
Looks great.
Awesome. All right, so I'm really excited to be presenting today on one of my dissertation chapters that was funded by an AOS student research grant. So I'm going to be talking about a study I did using geolocators and stable isotopes to look at the migration strategies of myrtle warblers breeding at high latitudes in northwestern North America. So my research is broadly focused on seasonal migration, which as ornithologists, many of us are probably already pretty familiar with. But to give just a quick background, migration is broadly the cyclical movement of animals between geographical areas, typically between a breeding range and a non-breeding range. And migration is an adaptation for dealing with seasonality. So migratory animals move in response to changes in resources, predation, or competition, and to escape harsh conditions in their breeding area. And in order to migrate successfully, an animal needs to have a really tightly integrated suite of adaptations that can be morphological, sensory, or behavioral that make sure that it is departing at the right time, moving to the correct location, and that the animal is physically capable of performing a really energetically strenuous migration. And many factors play a role in influencing migratory behavior. In many species, especially small songbirds, it's been shown that genetics play a strong role in controlling whether individuals migrate, what direction they migrate in, and their migratory timing. And birds also rely on environmental cues to know when to migrate and for navigation. Some longer-lived birds may incorporate information that they learn from past migrations into their migratory strategy. And birds that migrate in social groups might rely on more experienced individuals during their migrations. And these factors all are likely more or less important in different species. For small songbirds, which is the focus of my study, they don't have very long lifespans and they don't migrate in social groups. So genetics and environmental cues probably play a stronger role. And together, all these factors contribute to a lot of variation, both between species and within species in migratory strategies. Using a variety of different methods, researchers have found that there is a wide range of within species variation in migration routes that individuals follow. So in some species, individuals breeding in different populations all end up following a similar route to their non-breeding grounds. And then in others, different subspecies or populations follow different migration routes and winter in different areas. And new migration routes have also evolved just over the recent past, such as in the Eurasian blackcap, where some birds began wintering in Great Britain just within the last 50 years. And we're increasingly able to characterize these migration routes using tracking technologies, but this variation still remains unknown for many species. And also the processes that shape this variation are not very well understood. There have been several different hypotheses introduced to explain how migration routes form and why birds migrate where they do. And one is the optimal migration hypothesis, which proposes that migratory strategies evolve to minimize migration time, predation, or energy expenditure. And the overall cost of a certain migration route is a balance between a lot of different factors. This can include the distance of the route, the topography and the habitat quality that is present along the route, and the weather that the bird experiences during migration, including things like wind direction and speed. So while there are many factors that contribute to the cost of the route, migration distance is often used as a proxy for energetic cost. And if a shorter distance migration route has a lower energetic cost, we expect to see more direct routes between closer breeding and non-breeding areas. And we see this in many species where individuals that breed further east tend to migrate to more eastern non-breeding grounds, and those that are breeding in the west tend to migrate to more western non-breeding grounds. And as a range expands, this hypothesis predicts that we might see new routes arising that optimize energy expenditure. But in some species, we see migration routes that really don't seem to be energetically optimal at all. One really extreme example is the northern wheat ear, where populations that breed in North America migrate all the way across oceans and continents to winter in Africa. So this raises the question of why have new migration routes to winter in the Western Hemisphere never formed as the species range expanded? So one other hypothesis that might explain this observation is the historical contingency hypothesis, which proposes that migration routes might retrace paths of range expansion after the retreat of glaciers. During the last glacial maximum, when glaciers covered most of North America, species ranges were further south in unglaciated regions. And then as the glaciers retreated, ranges shifted northward, and present-day migration routes might be retracing those paths of expansion. This hypothesis was first proposed to explain different migration routes taken by coastal and inland population of Swainson's thrush. And both genetic data and habitat distribution modeling suggested that these subspecies were isolated in different glacial refugia and that their present-day migration routes reflect different paths of post-glacial range expansion. So this hypothesis might explain why some species, like the northern wheat ear, follow seemingly suboptimal migration routes. And these suboptimal migration routes imply that it's relatively difficult for new migration routes to arise. Studying high latitude populations provides a really great opportunity to test these two hypotheses for how migration routes form, but very few songbird populations breeding at high latitudes have been tracked. In some groups like the parulid warblers, which I study, breeding ranges often don't fill the full extent of available habitat at high latitudes, and we see that species that migrate farther tend to have smaller ranges. So this implies there may be some energetic constraints that are preventing birds from breeding too far from their non-breeding area. But the development of shorter migration routes to closer non-breeding areas could reduce the energetic costs of migration from these high latitudes. So for example, migration from Alaska might be prohibitively far for some birds, but if individuals began wintering in California, the shorter route might allow for range expansion to high latitudes. So in this project, I asked, does distance minimization as one proxy for the optimal migration hypothesis or historical contingency play a stronger role in shaping migration routes in a high latitude breeding songbird population? My study system is the myrtle warbler, which is one of the few parulid taxa whose breeding range extends all the way from the Atlantic coast to Alaska. And myrtle warblers have an interesting wintering range that has two disjunct concentrations. The main wintering concentration occurs along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, but myrtle warblers also are found wintering on the Pacific coast, particularly in California. So for this project, I asked, do myrtle warblers breeding in Alaska follow a shorter alternate migration route to the Pacific coast, as we might expect under the optimization hypothesis? Or do they migrate eastward across the boreal forest to the Gulf Coast, as we might expect under the historical contingency hypothesis? The myrtle warblers wintering in California were first described way back in the late 1800s by Richard McGregor, who proposed that they should be a new subspecies called Dendroica coronata hooveri. And the reason for this was that he measured longer wings and tails in birds that wintered in California compared to those that were in the East. And in that very first description, McGregor proposed that the California birds bred in Alaska and British Columbia. So today, we typically don't consider hooveri to be a valid subspecies, but modern studies of myrtle warblers breeding in Alaska have found that these birds do have significantly longer wings and tails, similar to the measurements that McGregor first described in California. And previous stable isotope work also supported this hypothesis that the myrtle warblers breeding in Alaska wintered in California. To give a quick primer on stable isotope analysis, we can use stable isotopes to infer where a bird migrated because the ratio of hydrogen isotopes in precipitation varies across the landscape, and the isotopes in a feather reflects the isotope ratio found in the location where that feather was grown. And myrtle warblers typically have 2 generations of greater covert feathers during the breeding season, with some feathers that were grown on the previous wintering ground and others that were grown on the previous year's breeding ground. So we can measure isotopes in these feathers to estimate where that bird spent the last winter in the previous breeding season. So Taves et al. Measured isotopes in feathers collected from myrtle warblers that were migrating through Vancouver, which is shown here by the yellow star, to try to infer where they were breeding and wintering. And from the feathers that were grown on the wintering ground, they found a high likelihood that these birds were wintering in California. From feathers grown on the breeding ground, they found that they most likely originated in northwestern North America, in Alaska, Yukon, and northern British Columbia. But this study had a few different limitations. So first, they only sampled birds during migration and not from across the breeding ground. So it's unclear what proportion of myrtle warblers breeding in northwestern North America are wintering on the Pacific coast. And then if there's a migratory divide between birds that are migrating east and west, the sampling scheme of this study wouldn't be able to locate that. And then also, as you can see from these maps, isotopes provide very broad location estimates. So while there's a high likelihood that these birds were wintering in California, there's also a high isotopic likelihood along the mid-Atlantic coast. So directly tracking myrtle warbler migration using geolocators can provide more fine-scale estimates of where these birds are spending the winter. So for my project, my goal was to investigate whether distance minimization or historical contingency played a stronger role in shaping the migration routes of these birds breeding at high northwestern latitudes. And to do that, I used two different approaches. So first, I directly tracked the migrations of myrtle warblers breeding in Anchorage, Alaska, using multi-sensor geolocators. This allowed me to characterize migratory strategies in really fine detail for a small number of birds. And then I also inferred wintering areas in a much larger sample of individuals from across the northwestern breeding range using stable isotopes. So this produces more broad scale estimates, but can cover a much larger sample size than you typically can with geolocators. So first, I'll talk about the geolocator component of this project. So we focused on myrtle warblers breeding in Anchorage, Alaska, and tracked them using archival geolocators because these are one of the few tags that can be used on small songbirds based on their weight. And traditional geolocators measure time and light levels, but we use newer multi-sensor geolocators that also measure air pressure and temperature. And you can use both light and air pressure to estimate the locations of the bird, which I will go into more detail later in the talk. So in June 2022, I deployed 30 light level geolocators on myrtle warblers that were breeding in Anchorage. I also color banded 25 control birds that were processed exactly like the geolocator birds, but they didn't receive a backpack. And because these really small loggers are not able to transmit data, you have to recapture the bird to retrieve the geolocator. So in June 2023, I returned to Anchorage and I found that 6 of our geolocator tag birds had returned for a 20% return rate, which is pretty typical for geolocator studies. And also 6 of our control birds had returned. So we didn't see any significant difference in return rate between our geolocator and control birds, which indicates that the geolocators weren't having a negative effect on the bird's ability to return. So once we had the data in hand, I inferred year-long location trajectories for each bird using 2 different methods. So first, I used the more traditional approach, which is to use light to determine locations, where you estimate locations from changes in the recorded light level over time. So the geolocator has this light stalk here, which measures ambient light intensity. And here's an example of what the raw data looks like. Here we have time by date on the x-axis, and then light intensity on the y-axis. So you can see that every day the light increases, stays bright throughout the day, and then decreases to the minimum at night. And these data are from summer. You can also see some data from the winter where the day length is shorter and the nights are longer, where we have really low light. And we can also plot light intensity over the full year with nighttime centered in the middle of the plot. Basically, each of these strips is one day, and this is how the light is changing over the day. And we can estimate the locations based on the timing of sunrise and sunset, which is where we see transitions between light and dark in the plot. And when we see a big shift in the timing of twilight, that means that the bird has probably moved to a different location. So these locations are estimated based on the timing of successive twilight events, which typically will identify a unique location on the globe. But there are some limitations for this light level method. The most significant is that this method can produce a lot of error in latitude estimates. This can be because of shading, especially in birds like warblers that spend a lot of time in foliage. And then, secondly, you can't estimate latitude at all during the equinox period because the day length is the same all over the world. So, this means that you lose a lot of data, especially that you collected during fall migration, because there tends to be very high overlap with the equinox. So, a more recently developed method that gets around some of these limitations is to track migration using atmospheric pressure. This is a plot of pressure measured by one of our geolocators over the full year. So you can see these sharp drops in pressure, and those occur when the bird is taking migratory flights at higher altitude. So from this data, we can see every single day that the bird is migrating, both during fall migration and spring migration. So to figure out locations from this pressure data, we use both the spatial and temporal variation in pressure. So first, for every stationary period in between our migratory flights, we use the pressure data to identify all the possible locations just based on the ground elevation. And then we narrow down these locations by comparing the changes in pressure over time that are measured by the geolocator to historical weather pressure data for all of our possible locations. So together, this allows us to produce a likelihood map for the bird's location at a given time, which you can see as the blue area on this map. And to do all of this, we use the R package geopressure R. So before I show you the results of our analysis, I'll just remind you of our alternative hypotheses. So if distance minimization plays a stronger role in shaping migration routes in these high latitude warblers, we expect that our Alaskan birds will take a shorter migration route to the Pacific coast, which is what was suggested by the previous studies. And then if migration routes are retracing past paths of post-glacial range expansion, we expect that the birds will follow a longer route to the Gulf Coast. So what we found was that contrary to our expectations from those previous studies, all 6 of our tracked birds migrated all the way to the Gulf Coast. So each of these maps shows the track for one bird based on the pressure data. The color shows the time of year for every stop, and then the size of the point is how long the bird stayed at that site. So we found that rather than migrate to the closest wintering area, our Alaska breeding birds actually took a much longer route to the main wintering concentration on the Gulf Coast. And when we overlay all of the tracks over each other, we can see that not only is each bird following similar routes for their fall and their spring migration, but overall they're following really similar routes through the boreal forest of Canada before then diverging to different wintering locations once they pass south at the Great Lakes. There are some places where it looks like the tracks seem to diverge, but it's more likely that that's just the result of uncertainty in the location estimates instead of true instances of birds diverging from the common path. So for example, at this one point along the orange track, this is the marginal likelihood of location based on the pressure data, where the warmer colors represent higher likelihood. And we can see that for this stopover, it's broad and split into 2 regions. So we can't rule out that this bird didn't just pass through the lower region, which is closer to our shared path. So overall, it seems like these birds are all taking very similar migration routes. Using pressure data allowed us to track these birds at a much higher resolution compared to the light data, because we could estimate the timing of every flight and the location of every stopover throughout the full year. And the pressure data also let us identify a much narrower region where the birds were wintering. So here for each of our 6 birds, we can see likelihood maps for the wintering location based on just light data alone, which is in red, pressure data alone in green, and then the combination of the light and pressure data in blue. And we found that typically the estimates overlapped really highly in terms of longitude, but we can see that the light data has a much higher uncertainty in terms of latitude. And the pressure data also let us characterize migration timing at a really fine scale. So this plot shows migration timelines for each of our 6 birds, with time spent on the breeding ground in green, the wintering ground in blue, and then fall and spring migration are shown by the yellow to red gradients. So we saw that most individuals departed the breeding ground around the same time in late August, but there was a lot more variation in the amount of time they spent migrating and on the wintering ground, where some birds migrated really quickly and then spent a longer time in their wintering area, and others had a more protracted migration with long periods spent on the stopover sites and then less time spent on the wintering ground. By looking at both the light and pressure data together, we can also learn about the day-to-day timing of migration. So here we have light data in the top plot and pressure data in the bottom plot, and the dark nighttime periods are shaded in both of the plots. So we can see that as we expect for a nocturnal migrant, most of the migratory flights where the pressure is dropping are occurring at night. But we do see some instances of short, low elevation flights occurring in the morning. And then one last advantage of using pressure data is that we can characterize flight altitude across the full year, which is unknown for most migratory birds. And most research on individual flight altitude has been done in Europe, so we really don't have a lot of data in North America. So here's a plot of altitude over time for one of our birds. We can see the bird starts out close to sea level in Anchorage, and then we can calculate the altitude of every migratory flight during the fall. Then we see the ground elevation of its wintering location in Charlotte, North Carolina, and then the flight altitudes for spring migration, and finally the return to Anchorage. So we found that the average flight altitude across all of our flights and all of our birds was a little over 800 meters above sea level, and the maximum altitude that any bird reached was just over 2,900 meters. And then one really cool finding is that this maximum altitude we found is really similar to the highest maintained flight altitude for captive myrtle warblers that were flown in a wind tunnel, which was recently published by Catherine Ivey. So it was really cool to see that our data in a natural system was really aligning with what was tested in an experimental captive system. And then finally, we can also zoom into individual flights and see how the altitude changes over the course of a single flight. So typically, we don't see that the bird is just flying to one altitude and staying there. We see a lot of variation throughout the flight, which might be the result of birds trying to find the most ideal wind conditions at different altitudes. And then one more interesting observation we found was that during some stationary periods, certain birds seem to make cyclical elevational movements between the daytime and the nighttime. So in this plot, we have day on the x-axis, and then the light level is in the top plot on the y-axis, and pressure is in the bottom plot. So we see that there are increases in pressure during the day where the bird is moving down 100 meters in elevation, and then it's returning to a higher elevation at night. So this probably results from birds that are moving between different foraging areas and roosting areas. So overall, while we found that the pressure data improved our migration tracks, it also provided a lot of additional information that you can't get from just light data alone. So while all of our geolocator tracks showed a similar pattern, 6 is obviously not a very large sample size. So we also used stable hydrogen isotopes to estimate wintering areas in a larger sample of 167 birds that were sampled across the northwestern breeding range. So comparing the hydrogen isotope ratios in precipitation between our two wintering areas, we expect that feathers grown on the western wintering range are going to have a lower isotopic ratio compared to feathers grown on the Gulf Coast. So for this isotope analysis, we used feathers that were collected during the breeding season in Anchorage, in northern British Columbia, and in Alberta. And because of the pattern of molt and myrtle warblers, we could collect feathers that were grown on the previous wintering ground. After analyzing the hydrogen isotopes in the feathers, we found a significant relationship between the hydrogen isotope ratio of feathers that were grown on the wintering ground and the longitude of the breeding ground where that feather was collected. So we found that feathers from birds breeding in Alaska tended to have lower isotope ratios compared to higher values in BC and Alberta. For each of these feather samples, I created probability density maps using the R package assign R, where darker colors represent locations where the feather has the highest likelihood of being grown. So from these isotope probability maps, we can see that feathers with higher isotope ratios were likely grown further south along the Gulf Coast, while for samples with low isotope values, the West Coast is included in our region of high probability. And then I performed an odds ratio test to determine which samples were more likely to have originated from the West Coast instead of the Eastern wintering range. So points below this dotted blue line represent samples that had a higher probability of being grown on the Pacific coast. We can't fully rule out that these birds might have wintered in the Northeast, as you can see from the isotope map, but this is a less common wintering area for myrtle warblers compared to the Gulf Coast. So it seems likely that a small set of our birds may have been wintering on the Pacific coast. So together from both our geolocator and our stable isotope studies, we can conclude that most myrtle warblers in our study area are actually wintering on the Gulf Coast, with just a small subset wintering on the Pacific coast. And we don't see a clear migratory divide between birds migrating east and west. Instead, it seems like a small proportion of birds from multiple different breeding areas are all wintering on the Pacific coast. This is similar to the pattern that's seen in Eurasian blackcaps, where birds recently began wintering in Great Britain, where in this species, a small proportion of birds from many different breeding locations in continental Europe all migrate to Great Britain. And the common migration route to the Gulf Coast that we see is consistent to what we'd expect based on the historical contingency hypothesis. Both population genetic analysis and paleodistribution modeling have suggested that myrtle warblers most likely occupied one glacial refugium in the southeastern United States during the last glacial maximum. So the migration route that we observed follows the likely path of expansion out of the refugium into northwestern North America. And interestingly, the route that all of our tagged birds took is highly similar to routes that were tracked in another parulid warbler from this region, the blackpoll warbler. Just like the myrtle warblers, the blackpolls migrate eastward across the boreal forest and then south to the Gulf Coast, the difference being that they then cross the Gulf of Mexico to fly to South America. But it's possible that these routes are so similar because both species might be following a similar path of expansion from the same glacial refugium. So the results of this study lead to a number of different follow-up questions. I sometimes feel like it raised more questions than it answered. Since we found that only a small proportion of birds in our study area might be wintering on the Pacific coast, where do most of those Pacific coast wintering myrtle warblers breed? So the previous stable isotope study of myrtle warblers that migrated through Vancouver Also identified areas that were farther north in Alaska and in Yukon and the Northwest Territories. So it might be that more birds that are breeding further north in areas that we didn't sample are migrating to the Pacific coast. Alternatively, there is one record of a band recovery for a myrtle warbler that was banded in Southeast Alaska that was recovered in California in the winter. So there may be birds breeding further south that are following this migration route as well. To answer this question, we could analyze isotopes in feather samples collected directly from myrtle warblers that are wintering on the Pacific coast, and then try to estimate their breeding locations. Or we could even try to deploy geolocators directly on Pacific coast wintering birds. One potential issue with that is we know these birds have relatively high breeding site fidelity, but we don't know how much site fidelity they have in the winter. So since we have to recapture these birds to get the geolocators, we might have much lower return rates by deploying them on the wintering ground. But that approach was helpful in that Eurasian blackcap study to figure out how many birds were migrating to Great Britain. But based on these different results, it's really not clear if there's a specific area where most Pacific coast breeding birds are coming, or wintering birds are coming from. So finally, some other remaining questions. In this study, we made the assumption that a shorter distance is a lower energy migration route. But as I mentioned before, there are other factors that affect the cost of a migration route. So it would be interesting to try to quantify the relative cost of the Pacific coast route versus the Gulf Coast route in terms of things like stopover habitat along the route, weather and wind direction, and topography. We also don't know if there are fitness differences between birds that are wintering on the Gulf Coast and the Pacific Coast. There have been a lot of studies that show that the quality of the wintering habitat can have carryover effects during breeding in how many offspring that these birds are producing. There might also be differences in survival during migration. And this could really have effects on why the birds are migrating to different areas. And then finally, it would be really interesting to look at if there are any genetic differences between the individuals that are migrating to the Pacific coast versus the Gulf Coast. As in other species, there have been specific loci associated with differences in migration direction. So finally, in conclusion, we found that our geolocator tracked myrtle warblers breeding in Alaska all migrated to the Gulf Coast rather than the Pacific coast, which is more consistent with the historical contingency hypothesis. Using stable hydrogen isotopes, we found that a small subset of individuals breeding across Alaska, British Columbia, and Alberta all may be migrating to the Pacific coast. And then overall, we found that using these multi-sensor geolocators that can measure atmospheric pressure allowed us to characterize migration routes and timing at a very fine scale compared to light level geolocation, and provided a lot of additional information on things like flight altitude and elevational movements. So based on that, we really encourage other researchers who are looking to do migration tracking studies to incorporate these pressure sensors into your geolocator study. So with that, I would like to thank everybody who made this project possible. Thanks to all of my co-authors, Johanna Beam, Mads Moore, Benjamin Van Doren, Alan Brelsford, and David Taves. Emily Griffith made these wonderful myrtle warbler illustrations that I used throughout my talk. I'm very thankful to Henry Strebe and Kim Sparks, as well as Raphael Nussbaumer for help with different methods I used in this project. And then, of course, big thanks to the American Ornithological Society. Through that research grant, I was able to purchase some of the geolocators along with funds from these other sources. So if you'd like to contact me, here's my email. I'm also on Blue Sky. I'm always happy to talk migration tracking. And this paper is currently available as a preprint on bioRxiv. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thanks so much, Steph. Fantastic talk. Great slides to help us understand where you're going and really enjoyed the story.
Thanks.
Although I think now the audience has lots of questions raised by your research. As you said, it opened up many questions. Um, so we'll get started. And just a reminder to the audience, you can put your questions in the chat, Q&A, or you can raise your hand. So we'll start off. Kamal Islam asks, how many males versus females were tagged and recovered?
Yes. So for the geolocator study, they were all males. And that is because we are capturing them using song playback. And so males tend to be a lot more responsive to that. And also, when we're putting out geolocators that we then need to recapture the next year, we wanted to be sure that we would have the easiest time recapturing those birds. So this study does have a male bias. That we didn't tag any female birds just because those are much more difficult to catch and we weren't sure if we would ever get that geolocator back again.
Interesting. About them all being male. Okay, so Nixon asks, other than the overall influence of annual weather patterns on warbler migration patterns observed, would you be able to venture any potential evidence of the role of food distribution on the local scale, day-to-day or month-to-month patterns of movement or choice of flight altitude?
Yeah, so that would be something really interesting to look at. And that's something that the pressure data is really helpful for because we can identify all of those stopover locations and how long the bird was spending at different stopovers, which isn't something we typically can figure out using light data. So we definitely could look at the quality of those different stopover habitats and if that's having an effect on migration rates. And that's something that I'm kind of looking at in my postdoctoral research, where I'm looking at the effects of vegetation phenology on migration timing at these stopover routes. So definitely something I'm interested in.
Erica Dunn asks, any hint of sex or age differences in split between lengths of migration and wintering stages, maybe for the isotope data, if different
Yeah.
sexes were?
So unfortunately, that's not something that we really can tell from this data set because even in the isotope data, it's still very heavily male biased just because of the methods that we're using to
Mhm.
catch these birds. Um, in terms of age, we did have a pretty good age distribution. And I don't think there was really any difference in terms of if we were looking at like second year after second year birds.
And Erica also asks, do you have any plans for more work using those MODIS tags?
Mm. So I don't have any immediate concrete plans for follow-ups. I have lots and lots of ideas that I would like to do along the line, but I do think using Modus could be interesting. One potential issue is that the Modus tower coverage is a lot lower in the Northwest. Um, so as long as they pass near towers like in California or along the Gulf Coast, you could potentially use Modus to try to figure out where they're going. But there are some gaps that could like make it a little bit harder.
Um, Great. And Avani's friend John, it says here in the message. Okay. Do you know why the birds spent different times migrating in the spring versus fall?
Yeah, so typically, and this is not just in myrtle warblers, but across all kinds of birds, it's much more common for spring migration to be a lot faster than fall migration. And the thought for that is that these birds have a very high selective pressure to arrive on the breeding grounds as early as they can, so they can establish a good territory, start finding mates, and start reproducing during the breeding season. In the fall, there's not really as much pressure aside from winter conditions approaching, so they can kind of take their time during migration, as long as they don't wait too long until it starts snowing or something.
Got you. And we had a stopover talk a month or two ago, something like that, that sort of addressed some of those variables, if anyone wants to look that up. Um, Michael Mahoney says, thank you, Steph. Really interesting presentation. What is happening with Audubon's yellow rump warblers in the places where you were capturing birds? Do you have any thoughts on the interaction of these two subspecies, the role that might play in myrtle warbler migration? Yeah.
Yeah. So the areas that I was capturing birds for my study, only myrtle warblers are found, because I was like way up north. Um, so of course, on the wintering ground, on the Pacific coast, both of them are found there. So I wasn't directly capturing birds there or studying them, but there definitely are probably some kind of interactions going on that would be really interesting to look at. But yeah, the reason my talk is just focusing on myrtles is I was just up in that northern range where Audubons are not found.
Got you. And Stanley Senner asks, at about 13,000 to 18,000 years ago, there was a cordilleran ice sheet covering the southeastern coastal Alaska and coastal British Columbia. But by 10,000 years ago, uh, there was an ice-free path from Alaska to California. And I wonder how that might figure into the picture, if you're familiar with that, Steph.
Yeah. I think that could potentially explain the timeline of maybe the California route being more recently evolved, um, where we had um, the expansion from the southeastern refugia happening after the last glacial maximum, and then maybe we had another this newer route arose after that other ice sheet melted. So it would be cool if we could somehow time when these migration routes uh, arose, but unfortunately, I don't think there's a very easy way to do that. Um,
But certainly interesting thought there. Um, yeah, just checking all the questions. Okay, Nick Masto asks, how or are there any surveys, for example, eBird or Christmas bird count, that align with your stable isotope results for wintering site proportion, Gulf versus Pacific, timing or distributions? He says, fantastic presentation, amazing slides.
yeah. So as far as timing of like when the birds are arriving on the wintering ground, that's definitely something that you can get from eBird, um and yeah, there are models like estimating when the birds are arriving in these different sites. Um, Something that you wouldn't necessarily get from those types of surveys, but you could get from banding data, and museum collections that I would be interested in, um, is what proportion of myrtle warblers in the Gulf Coast have that longer wing size. Because like the very early studies, they were kind of saying the California wintering birds have these long wings, the Gulf Coast birds don't. But for my study, clearly those bigger birds are going there. And I looked at like the size of the birds that were going to each location, and it didn't seem to be any kind of pattern, like only the big ones are going to the Pacific coast. So it would be cool to look at specimens or look at banding data and see kind of what proportion of birds have those longer wings and like the Hooveri range.
Got you. And then some females could be added in as well with those data sets.
Yeah.
Um, I think I'm just looking at the questions. I think So I just wanted to ask, the recorders do in the one slide, the recorders do measure four variables,
Mhm.
right? So is there anything you can do with those other variables? Do you have those data sets?
Yeah, so the time, light, and pressure, I used all of those in my study. The
Mhm.
fourth one is temperature, which I kind of briefly played around with the temperature data just out of curiosity to see like what was the temperature during different seasons. Um, I'm not really sure how accurate that is in terms of measuring ambient temperature. Like I could see it
Mhm.
maybe being influenced by being on the bird. Like, does the bird's body
Mhm.
heat change that at all? So, um, I haven't used that to like try to directly answer any questions, but it is something that um, is used. You could see maybe using it in a similar way as the pressure data of looking at the historical weather data and seeing what temperature was it in different locations and using that to narrow it down, but it really depends on like how accurate those temperature readings are.
I see. Like if you try or you didn't test it or you tested it and like it was thrown off
I
or it's
didn't
still
test
pending.
it.
Okay,
I
just
didn't
just,
test it. I
just
guess
kidding.
you could maybe
Mhm.
just have the tag by itself, see what temperature recorded,
Yeah,
put
right.
it
Just
on a
set it.
bird at the same time and see
Yeah.
if it's different.
Yeah, give it to that captive yellow rump warbler
Yeah.
group and see what they. Um, and then I just wanted to ask on the one graph they changed altitude between the day and night,
Mhm.
and on the graph it was lower during the night, I think, and then on the graph it was higher during the day.
Yeah, so
Uh,
that graph was showing pressure.
oh,
So the
pressure. Okay,
elevation they're at is the opposite. So the pressure was going um, up at night, which means, or sorry, no, it was going up during the day, which meant they were at a lower
I see.
elevation. So they may have been traveling like into a valley to forage and then going uphill at night.
Was that like, were there other movements that you saw, or was it consistent with that pattern? Was it ever reversed, a bird that went up at night, if I got that right?
Yeah, I think
Um,
there were the opposite as well.
oh, okay.
Um, but yeah, they often seemed to be like returning to a similar elevation. So probably
Regardless of
the
the direction.
same two sites, but that spatial scale is too small that you couldn't tell apart like
Okay.
exactly
Gotcha.
what they're at.
Shoot. Um, and uh, here, Tom Will asks, says, I know nothing about genetics, but do we have any idea where the genome migratory information is encoded? I think you hinted this a little bit, this at the end. And if so, any idea about mutation rates in that portion of the genome that might shed light on the flexibility, changeability of migratory pathway?
Yeah. So this is also something I'm very interested in, and this is what the first and third chapters of my dissertation was about. I just am presenting on the kind of movement ecology one for this talk. Um, but yeah, there have been a lot of studies looking for genetic regions that are associated with migratory differences. And overall, it seems like there are typically many different genes that are all interacting, which makes sense because this is a very complex behavior. So it's often not just one locus that is really strongly associated with one trait. There are instances like in vermivora warblers, in the golden wing and blue winged warblers, there's one gene, VPS13A, that seems to be very heavily associated with migration direction and wintering area. So there are some scenarios where there are like specific genes that have been identified. A lot of the time, there's like many different genes that all are associated with some kind of migratory difference. Um, as far as mutation rate, I don't know if that has been directly tested, but it's also thought that gene regulation probably plays a very strong role. So, um, a lot of the genetic effects are not necessarily sort of new mutations arising, but differences in how genes are regulated, and a lot of different mutations and potentially just standing variation that's changing in frequency between different populations. So, yes, I could give a whole other talk about that topic.
So stay tuned. We got the sandwiched second chapter
Yeah.
in between the
Yeah.
one
It's
and
just
three.
this was the one that was funded by AOS. So I decided to present on it.
Yeah, check out more Tay's lab research.
Yeah. Lots of good
Interesting.
warbler genomics
Mhm.
work coming out of Tay's lab.
Um, I just wanted to quickly ask the covert molting that allows for that winter and breeding ground measurement, is that common molting across many species? Like, could you use that strategy in a variety of different migratory birds,
Yeah.
or is that
I'm really not sure about that. I haven't really looked at a lot of other species, and I'm by no means a molt expert. I know a lot of people know more
okay?
about that than I do. But I don't think it is incredibly common, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay, I was just curious if that was unique to warblers or what that was. Um, yeah, so I'm just looking across here. I think uh oh oh yeah, okay, this is a good question. Anonymous attendee asks, do you know where Audubon myrtle hybrid warblers migrate?
Yeah, so there has been a little work on that using like orientation cages. I don't think there's been tracking to figure out exactly where they migrate, but that's definitely a much more unknown question, and it would be very fun to put geolocators on them.
Anonymous attendee, if you're trying to do a PhD, that's not a bad idea for your work. Um, yeah, so thanks everybody for so many great questions. Just making sure I got to everything. And we are right about at the top of the hour. I just want to thank Steph for such a great, amazing, such a well-polished presentation that I hope everyone enjoyed as much as I did. And thank you for fielding all of our various warbler and migration questions. And people are saying great talk and clapping and stuff. So I think everybody really enjoyed it. And just want to say thank you one more time, and we will see you here next week.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.